for our first pop-up, I think, for the winter quarter. Thank you for coming to listen to us talk about this incredibly important and very much evolving situation in Venezuela. Just to level set everything, as everyone knows, earlier this month, the United States captured the authoritarian leader of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, in a dramatic military operation following months of deadly strikes on a variety of vessels in the region, and imposed blockade on Venezuela, including seizing of oil tankers off the coast. Now the United States appears to be supporting Maduro's number two, Delcy Rodriguez, who's currently in charge of the country, rather than the opposition party that was supported in the 2024 election there, a result that Maduro declined to accept. The Trump administration has said that its actions in the area are to stop a narco-terrorism and cocaine trafficking conspiracy, but it's also true that Venezuela boasts the largest oil reserves in the world. Some have speculated that the White House's campaign against Caracas is really about regime change in Cuba, which relies heavily on Venezuelan oil imports. And President Trump's been pretty clear about his desire to bring the region under the United States sphere of influence. This week, the opposition leader, María Corina Machado, is meeting with President Trump in Washington, and Congress, as we speak, I think, is legislatively contemplating whether it wants to play a role, again, in war powers, which has been its historic role. So we want to talk about this, I think, today from basically three perspectives: the United States, specifically Washington, in the country of Venezuela, and the impact globally. And we're very lucky that we have some great experts with us today here in the room and on Zoom to do that. Next to me is my former colleague, Julian Barnes, a U.S. intelligence and international security reporter for the New York Times, who came from Washington today to join us. Thank you so much. On Zoom, I'm UChicago professor of political science, Michael Albertus, over there on the left. And on the right is Génesis Dávila, a human rights lawyer and founder of Defiende Venezuela and a former IOP fellow. Joining us later in the hour will be Representative Don Bacon from Capitol Hill. He's voting right now, but he'll be here on the Zoom when he's done with that. And as usual, we will leave plenty of time after we've done some back and forth here for all of your questions. So let's start with that warm up. Julian, bring us up to speed from the perspective of what's going on in DC.
So the Trump administration believes they had a very successful capture operation against Nicolás Maduro. It succeeded beyond their expectations in terms of the military execution of that, which has resulted in emboldened Donald Trump. And, you know, he has been pretty blunt about what he expects out of the Venezuelan government, about what he expects from American oil companies. And whereas the rhetoric before, when we were doing the boat strikes from August all the way through, was very much counter drugs, even though Venezuela is a transit, not a producing company. But it was always this: Maduro is a cartel leader, this is a counter-narcotics operation. But of course, now the rhetoric is much more about the oil, much more about energy security. And we also have a kind of message of stability here from the Trump administration as they're working with Delcy Rodriguez, as you mentioned, the vice president, acting president. President Trump does have a meeting with Maria Machado, the leader of the opposition, the Nobel Prize laureate. That's a pretty critical meeting this week in terms of whether we hear from the administration if they have a plan to move toward a more democratic government, and what that might be. So that's kind of where we are. It's a pretty interesting moment post this military operation where we have, as I said, an emboldened President Trump and a national security advisor in Marco Rubio saying, when the president says something, you should believe that he's going to do it. So it has shifted the dynamics in Washington.
Now, Jesus, I know that you've been working closely with the opposition in your capacity as a human rights lawyer, and will be there, obviously, on the ground in Washington where you are today. When Maria Corina Machado shows up in Washington, we'd be interested to hear about that. But what is your understanding of what's happening in your home country of Venezuela? We see a diaspora really excited to see the ouster of Maduro, who was obviously a brutal and also incompetent dictator, gone. But this isn't really truly regime change. So I'm curious what you're hearing from people on the ground. And also, do people in Venezuela, and I ask obviously people, that's, I don't mean to, you're gonna express the opinion of every human being in Venezuela, but is it generally accepted, this theory of the case that in fact Maduro was running a drug cartel out of Venezuela?
Yes, well, thank you so much for the questions. And I think that here and there are many different perspectives. As you mentioned, I cannot talk on behalf of all of the Venezuelan people, but as a Venezuelan, I can express how do I feel, and also how the Venezuelans that I know and with whom I have been having these conversations about what is happening are expressing, right? So first, I must say that as a Venezuelan, I'm really happy with the operation, because finally Maduro is detained. And that was something that we were expecting for many years, not only because since 2024, he had been an illegitimate president who is usurping power, but also because all of the human rights violations they have been committing in the country. So we have thousands of political prisoners that ended up arbitrarily detained just because they were identified as people that were opposing the regime. They were also subjected to torture, and also many people died in Venezuela because they were protesting against the regime, or just because the regime identified them as opposition members. So for us, it's a matter of justice, even when we know that, well, now that he is detained, the charges against him are for drugs. And then regarding the, narco traffic in Venezuela, yes, the regime is using hunger, repression, and drugs to stay in power. And that has been what has been sustaining the regime for many years. So it is a structure that is difficult to understand, but at the end, that was what gave them power. So they use hunger because, while people, they don't have food, they don't have public services, then they cannot oppose the regime actively. So you don't have time to go on the streets and fight against the regime if you don't have food for yourself or your family, right? Or then that type of situations are the situations that are forcing you to leave the country. And once you leave the country, you cannot oppose the regime, because even when Venezuelans have the right to vote, even if they are not living in Venezuela, the regime is also denying these rights. And then last year, when they lost the election just with the vote of the Venezuelans that are still remaining in the country. And still, they got 70% of the votes against them. And they couldn't count with the 8 million of Venezuelans that are outside of the country that for sure they will have voted against the regime. And then regarding drugs, so the regime have been using drugs to stay in power because that's a way for them to create money, but also to control all the criminal structure in Venezuela. So the militaries are part of this criminal structure. So Maduro is like the top of the government, is the top of an illegitimate government, and this structure operates like under his command. So he is not only in charge of this like a military structure for repression, but also to move drugs around the country and outside of Venezuela. So it's complicated because in general, like every country has like a mafia or like these gangs that are operating in the country, but in Venezuela, it's different. In Venezuela, there is a mafia that controls the country and operates the country. So that's like an important point to understand the dynamics in Venezuela.
And I want to go to you, Professor, 1 second, but just quickly, Genesis, and we'll return to this. But in terms of the arbitrary detentions, all of the human rights abuses under Maduro, I know that the government started to release some political prisoners in an effort to signal some changes there, but we know that those who've openly applauded Maduro's capture seem to still be on the receiving end of arbitrary detentions and abuses. So really anything immediately better for lives of people in Venezuela considering that?
Yeah, so imagine this. When Maduro was detained, one of the conditions that requested the US was the liberation of the political prisoners. That day, Jorge Rodriguez, who is the president of the National Assembly and also the brother of Delcy Rodriguez, who is now the acting president, gave a press conference saying that the regime will be liberating political prisoners as a unilateral act of good faith. And here, what is important to understand is that there is no good faith from the regime liberating political prisoners because, in first place, these detentions are illegal, are arbitrary detentions, and a proof to that is that they liberate them without any legal process, just with a political act. So they don't want to show to the Venezuelan people that are still in the country that they are at this moment fully collaborating with the US government. So they are trying to pretend that these liberations are like their own will, and that they are doing this because the Spanish government is convincing them of liberating political prisoners. So they start liberating 12 political prisoners during the first day. Until today, the liberation has been of over 60 political prisoners, according to civil society organizations, but according to the regime, the number goes to 100 political prisoners. Nonetheless, the number of political prisoners in the country is around 1,000 political prisoners. So
there still seems to be a lot of abuse in the streets. I want to recognize Representative Bacon. I think he's joining us. Let me quickly go to you, Professor, though. Why do you suspect that Trump abandoned his 2019 approach to supporting opposition party in Venezuela, and in fact, rigorously supporting it? You wrote, before the operation occurred, I think in the Atlantic magazine, Venezuelans may decide to migrate if they believe opportunity is not being regenerated quickly enough, or if the state cannot rein in social violence. So what is your observation about this change in the administration's support policies?
Yeah, in many ways, and thanks, by the way, for looping me into this event. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person. I'm on leave now at Stanford for the winter and spring quarters. But I recognize some faces in the room, so it's good to see folks. So the Trump administration has done, I think, in many ways surprised a lot of people, not only in the operation and kind of how it happened, and in some sense the narrowness of the operation, to target Maduro, and that was it, but also to very quickly close the door to the opposition, right? So, we've already talked about María Corina Machado, and Edmundo Gonzalez was the candidate who won the election in 2024, and very quickly Trump dismissed them and dismissed a role for them in the post-intervention plan for next steps in Venezuela. I'm hesitating to say, I feel like I should say transition, but I'm not so convinced that there's going to be a transition. We will see. At least I don't know that that's plan A. That might be plan B or plan C, but I'm not sure that it's plan A. Why it is that Trump decided to pass over Machado, I think there's a lot of theories that are kind of floating out around there, that have to do with him feeling snubbed for the Nobel Peace Prize, among other things. But I think that the reality, and I've written about this, is that a transition to democracy in Venezuela is not going to be quick or easy or seamless. It would be difficult because of the changes that have happened under Chavez and under Maduro, namely the gutting of the state, the collapse of the country's economy. It's hard to talk about Venezuela without underscoring the notion that their GDP has shrunk by 75% in the last decade, in less than the last decade, which is just remarkable. As Génesis already mentioned, there's 8 million Venezuelans that have fled. So we're talking in many ways about something like a failed state. And certainly the Socialist Party, the ruling Socialist Party, has consolidated power and has captured institutions. And there's this proliferation of armed actors, many different military forces, secret police, guerrillas, groups that are near the Colombian border, colectivos, which are like urban militias. There's a lot of different military forces on the ground. That makes it very difficult to try and do a quick transition to democracy or a relatively rapid one without undergoing or undertaking many of the fundamental struggles that are part and parcel of a democratic transition. And in my view, the Trump administration is simply not prepared right now to engage in the bigger project, in the broader project of bringing back democracy in Venezuela and all that would entail. And so, in my view, unless they are pushed into doing so, it's going to be a slow process if they ever sort of get there. But I don't think that's plan A, and maybe not plan B.
You would even agree with that perspective. I mean, first of all, is democracy even on the to-do list for the Trump administration in this operation? Candidly, short-term or long-term outcome. Do you agree with the professor's analysis? What do you think is the reason that Trump is kind of putting their finger on the scale and in a different way than they did a few years ago on what the future leadership should be in the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one, this was about getting Maduro, right? It wasn't about anything more than that. And the agenda after that was stability, not democracy, right? This was about Maduro. It was not about the Machado or Gonzalez or the rightful winner of that election, right? There are people within the administration who believe eventually there should be a pathway for Machado and her party to win another election. So I think it's highly unlikely. I think it's all but impossible that we'll see Trump after the Thursday meeting say, oh, we're going to recognize the 2024 elections. Like, I just don't think that's not going to happen. But in time, with pressure from the Venezuelan people, from pressure from within the administration, there are people who would like to see ultimately a democratic government. But the most important thing is to get more assured access to the oil. The most important thing for Donald Trump is access to the oil, and that requires stability in Venezuela, and that requires continuity in the government, and that there was intelligence assessments right before this operation, but even going back 6 months, that said Delcy Rodriguez was the kind of person who would make an agreement with the Trump administration and also keep control of security forces, and so that you would not have a situation of chaos where you would have, I mean, already American companies have expressed reservations about going back into Venezuela. You saw Exxon say that they did not find Venezuela a reliable place to do business. So without some sort of continuity and stability, you're not going to see Conoco come back. You're not going to see Chevron make more investments. And for Donald Trump, that's the lens he's looking at this through.
And so Génesis, as a longtime supporter of the opposition, and remain passionately so, just what the two of them just said, does that jive with what you're understanding? Does that comport with what you're expecting this week in Washington? What do you candidly view is going to be the ongoing role of Maria Corina? What do you think is going to be the outcome of this meeting?
Well, with Trump, everything is unpredictable, but I believe that Maria Corina, without a doubt, is the leader of the democratic movement in Venezuela. And without Maria Corina as the leader of this democratic movement, we wouldn't be here. And when I say we, I mean like Venezuelans, the regime, and even Trump in charge of this operation. Because at the end, as they mentioned before, this operation was about the removal of Maduro from Venezuela. And then there are many things that comes after that, and also the justification that the US found to do this was through drugs. But at the end, I believe that at some point, it's going to be unavoidable that Maria Corina is going to be the leader of the country. And for Venezuelans, what matters is to have a real transfer of power and that the will of the Venezuelan people is respected. So if they recognize the elections of 2024, that will be perfect. That will be like the ideal scenario. But if they don't do it, but at some point we manage to have free and fair elections, and then the elected president gets to be the president in power, that is also going to be perfect for the Venezuelan people. You know, like last year, they lost with 70% of the vote against them. So even a new election for Maria Corina will not be like a difficult thing, you know, like she won even when she was not the candidate, because when Venezuelan people voted for Edmundo González, they did it for Maria Corina because she asked the Venezuelan people to vote for him, you know. So even if that is the situation, I believe that is going to be a positive scenario for the Venezuelan people, you know. And the Venezuelan people, we are believers of democracy. We gave to Maduro what he was not willing to give to the Venezuelan people, which was a democratic resolution to this problem. That's why Venezuelans decided to organize themselves and to vote even when they knew that they were risking their life voting against the dictator. And from the very beginning of the campaign, he was promising a bloodbath to those who were voting against him, you know. And after just 2 weeks of the election, they incarcerated over 2,000 political prisoners and they killed 25 people on the streets, you know. So
Professor, can you synthesize a little bit of what we just heard? So Génesis is kind of talking about free will in Venezuela. We've alluded to the oil. Venezuela has a lot of it. There's a lot of risks, as Julian alluded to, and impediments to extracting it, beginning with the fact also that oil prices themselves have fallen more than 20% in the last year. As Julian mentioned, only Chevron's been able to regularly export oil since Chavez partly nationalized the country's oil supply years ago. And as he mentioned, CEO of Exxon said that it's not stable enough. That obviously invited the ire of President Trump. Génesis is presenting an optimistic scenario for the opposition. Julian's a little more skeptical, I think, especially the unpredictability of Trump, but also what his actual motivations are, which may not be leading with democracy or even the free will of the people in the country. So synthesizing those views, I mean, what do you suspect we might see? And I realize, of course, it's completely unpredictable, but how do you synthesize all these different stakeholders in this country, some with free will, some without?
Yeah, in many ways, I would say you don't. You simply don't. You cannot synthesize all these disparate points of view and come out with some sort of a coherent picture. And I think that in other words, I believe that there are many tensions in the current arrangement and that it's not very stable ultimately. I don't think ultimately this is going to be a very stable situation. So take, for example, some of the points that Julian mentioned, right? So in particular, the administration has made it very clear now that the fundamental goals right now are a stable regime and oil extraction, right? And that the United States is effectively going to sort of run Venezuela by, staying parked off the coast and, threatening them or presenting a credible threat of reintervention if they don't comply with the demands of Washington, right? At the same time, however, the oil majors like Exxon are saying Venezuela is uninvestable. They don't believe that this arrangement is going to be stable for long enough that they're going to be willing to invest. And it's not hard to imagine why that is, right? I mean, in many ways, Chavez basically cleared out the human capital of PDVSA, which is the state-run oil company, Venezuela's state-run oil company, in the early to mid 2000s. Since then, it's been, the oil infrastructure and knowledge within PDVSA and the oil sector has basically declined. And so it's going to take years of significant investment to have a return on that investment for the oil majors. And they're sitting here thinking, am I going to invest for 2, 3, 5 years? And then somehow I'm going to start, predictably getting profits from this. It's a very uncertain bet. And so, I think that when you start to, peel away the layers of the onion and start to try and follow through, maybe a better way to say it is follow the different strains or different threads of logic that the Washington is putting forward, they start to fall apart, I think. And that's why I believe that there's a lot of fundamental tensions here. We also talked about the stability within the Venezuelan regime. That is also, the regime has stuck together so far, but they are in a very difficult position. They're in the position of, they now have, one faction that's sort of running the government, Delcy Rodriguez, which is, together with her brother Jorge, it represents the continuity. But you also have, the interior minister, the defense minister that, have a lot of power and that have their own sort of preferences. Certainly the fundamental preferences are that the regime sort of sticks together. But when they're pushed against the wall, with their backs against the wall by the Trump administration to say, okay, give us more, give us more, give us more, whether it comes to, whether it's the release of political prisoners or, oil extraction or whatever it might be, there's going to be fundamental tensions there. And then there's also going to be these tensions from civil society, from María Corina Machado and others who are trying to push the Venezuelan regime into a difficult corner. And so keeping that all together, I think, is going to be very difficult.
And hopefully Representative Bacon will join us soon and we can hear more from the view and what's happening in Congress specifically. Let's open up the aperture a little bit more to talk about this a little bit more globally. Julian, and any of you can join in on this too. China has supplanted the United States as the largest trading and investment partner in Latin America. They've been following Trump's comments, singling out other countries with warnings, such as Colombia. China and Russia both have so far been pretty quiet in response to this. Do you think that this reads to them like a green light to bolster their own spheres of influence moves, Taiwan, other areas of Europe? What are we to take from China and Russia's reaction or non-reaction? And what do you think that they're absorbing for themselves in this?
Well, clearly pushing out Russia, pushing out China from Venezuela, and indeed the Western Hemisphere to reduce their influence is a key goal of a number of people within the Trump administration, right? That this was designed to weaken their positions. Indeed, like Marco Rubio, like one of his first demands was that afterwards that the advisors, the Chinese and Russian advisors to the Venezuelan government be kicked out, right? So this was a move to assert American dominance in the Western Hemisphere at the expense of China, which has invested a lot in port facilities, in the canal, in mineral rights. So we've seen, that China doesn't really just take these things. I think it's a little too simplistic to say, okay, the US has embraced spheres of influence, and that means there is a green light for Russia in Ukraine and China in Taiwan. You know, I don't, there are certainly people within the Trump administration who don't care that much about Taiwan, and there are other people who are saying, like, they are so integrated with our economy that to upset the status quo there would cause economic calamity around the world and, you know, would weaken the United States with important allies like Korea and Japan. So the more traditional view still has some sway. But this is not an unimportant event, right? And as we saw, like Putin used the US invasion of Panama in 1989 to justify his interventions in Georgia, in Ukraine, and elsewhere. We will see both China and Russia use the Maduro operation to justify whatever they want to do when it is at odds with international law. So this will not be without repercussions, even if I think it's unlikely that this means like we're going to have an invasion of Taiwan next year.
And Professor, how does that resonate with you? And particularly, I would say through a historic context, through what history teaches us. I don't know if this would be relevant to this. I saw that that there was an op-ed today in the New York Times where there was a mild comparison to the Bay of Pigs. Now, obviously, it's not the same because we saw what happened on the ground was nothing like the Bay of Pigs, but that the outcome could be that way. So, what in the long term? From the lens of history? How do you reflect on what Julian just said?
I'm in agreement with just about everything that he said, and certainly with the conclusions that, you know, this does have this does have repercussions, right? We're going to see repercussions not only of this event, but also of, you know, the broader repositioning of U.S. national security, you know, towards this, you know, Monroe Doctrine, as Trump calls it, but basically, you know, an expanded version of the Monroe Doctrine, and this kind of repositioning, you know, certainly within Latin America and the Western Hemisphere, but also vis-a-vis other major powers. I think we're going to see implications of this moving forward. You know, and this is not for this event, but you can think about implications in Iran and Greenland, both of which are in the headlines, you know, associated with this, but also more close to home with Cuba, with Colombia, right, with Mexico. I think we're going to see implications in all these places for what's happening right now. At the same time, I also agree that, you know, I don't think this is going to yield simply, or that Russia and China will simply read this as saying, okay, well, now, you know, we're going to parcel the world up into our spheres of influence and everybody's going to be kind of doing their own thing, right? In the broad scheme, you know, Venezuela is not the key partner for Russia or for China, right? And so they can take, you know, small, you know, comparatively small losses in this particular instance, and balance that against, you know, some of their other interests that they have. For example, you know, Russia's interest in getting its way in Ukraine, right, and the ongoing negotiations it's having with the United States over that. And so I do think that there are broad implications, but also I don't think it will necessarily yield to this sort of, or devolve into this kind of a strict breaking up the world into different spheres of influence.
Thank you so much. Congressman Bacon, thank you for joining us. Can you hear us? I think you're on mute, sir. Is he on mute, or have we muted him? You're on mute, sir. Now, now we're all on mute.
Okay, now I'm good. I got you. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you. Welcome to Hyde Park via Washington via the Zoom. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate. We know how busy you guys are on the Hill today. Let me just dive in with you really quickly. So you were a critic of the administration's boat actions before the taking of Maduro, but you seem to be pretty supportive of that operation. I'm very curious, first of all, what you and your colleagues are, obviously, is there any consensus around Venezuela right now? And what, the administration has firmly promised no boots on the ground in the country. What are you thinking personally right now? What are your fears going forward? And what are I guess your hopes and your fears at this juncture?
Well, first of all, thank you. And I just got done voting. Otherwise, I would have been on here 20 or 30 minutes ago. But I had to vote at the chamber, run back to the office. I think you characterized my Venezuela views sort of close, but I don't mind hitting drug boats, but I thought continued operations require congressional approval. I can see if you did one operation, you can back brief the Congress, but if you do continued operations, I think you have to seek a congressional authority. I surely don't like drugs coming to our country or other countries. I think I could be, if they would have come to the Congress and made their case, I'd been inclined to vote yes, but I want to protect Article 1 authorities. When it comes to the actual capture of Maduro, I realize he's a bad character. I mean, he's taken Venezuela from being the wealthiest country in South America to the poorest country. He's done away with their freedoms. I'm no fan of Maduro. That said, I have concerns. Right now, what bothers me is we have the vice president of Venezuela acting as the leader. She's just as crooked as he is. I don't like the thought of the United States taking out one dictator and say, okay, now we'll put the other dictator in. And she was as linked up with the cartels as Maduro was. I think our goal should be to put the legitimate people in power, which would be Gonzalez. Perhaps you make the case for Machado, or we should have scheduled elections soon. I want our foreign policy to be at a higher end, dealing with the higher values. And right now, it appears that we're going to put another bad dictator in so we can control the oil. I feel like that's not high enough values for what I believe that if we're going to use military option, what it should be. So I am inclined to vote for the War Powers Resolution when it comes on the floor this week or next week. I think the president has to make his case for continued operations, and then we should be able to vote on it. So I'm inclined to vote on the War Powers Resolution. I know right now it's Massey and me, strange bedfellows, we're on the opposite ends of the Republican spectrum, but we'll see who else does. And part of the reason I'm inclined to vote on it, because I was sort of divided, I do not like the talk about Greenland at all. I think it's wrong. They're our ally. I served in NATO. I'm a 30-year Air Force guy, retired as a 1-star. And I think this talk about Greenland really angers me. The comment about I'm not constrained by anything but other than my own morals, to me, that gives me the impetus to want to constrain them as much as we can and force them to work with Congress. So hopefully that answers your question.
It does. Well, how about your friends across the rotunda in terms of Article 1 and War Powers Act? I mean, this has been debated since the Iraq War, since the operations in Afghanistan. There's been a lot of tension on Capitol Hill for 2 decades about reasserting Congress's power and war powers. There seemed to be some movement with your Republican colleagues in the Senate, and at least one seems to have been picked off by that. What's your sense? Can Congress finally come together? And quite bluntly speaking, it's really in the hands of Republicans to do that, right? So will they turn against their president if he doesn't like that and go ahead and move forward? What's your prediction there?
Well, when he bashed the 5 Republicans who voted for it in the Senate, that bothered me. So that also reaffirmed that I want to vote for the War Powers Act when it comes back up, because he should feel constrained. Congress has a role here. We're going to vote on the same bill. I believe it's the same bill late this week or next week, and I'm going to vote for it. Now, here's the interesting thing, and I think this is a bipartisan criticism. If Joe Biden was doing this, I think you'd have the Democrats defending it and Republicans out of their chairs angry, demanding war powers. Now that President Trump's doing it, you have some of our guys, I'd rather not mention their names, but they're like, hey, we have unified government. We shouldn't be trying to undermine the president because we're unified. Well, I disagree. I see this is Article 1 and reestablishing Article 1 powers. I do think we'll get more votes. And I think if we have a war powers resolution, I believe we'll pass the House with a very small number of Republicans. But we only need 3 Republicans right now if the Democrats vote unified.
I'm going to open it up in just a minute here to start thinking of your questions. But Julian, I would just like you to respond to that. And I know you're not a Hill reporter, but you're a longtime Washington reporter and you've watched the politics of national security. Do you agree with what the congressman said? I mean, in terms of this is a partisan issue, or do you think this is a place where people are going to finally come together? Obviously, there have been bipartisan pushes for for constraint, particularly certainly in the Iraq veteran community, for example, where you saw the left and right come together around that kind of split up principally over Ukraine. But what do you think? I mean, where do you see Washington as a political entity going here?
Well, first of all, you're far more expert at Congress than I am, so I should listen to you. But it's been a remarkable year of retreat on congressional power that has upended the traditional role of the traditional way our Congress works. I mean, my son is taking a AP Gov, he's senior in high school, taking an AP Gov class. And I'm like, yeah, that's how it's supposed to work, but that's not how it works at all. Look at what we saw this year. We saw the executive branch limit the oversight of intelligence agencies, saying no longer can individual members of intelligence committees go to do oversight at the DIA, the NGA, any of the spy agencies. We saw the power to make war is reserved in Article 1 for the Congress. And obviously, this has been a retreat over many decades. We've seen many presidents do this. But as Rep. Bacon was indicating, this was a different kind of use of military force. You got a drug cartels labeled as terrorists, and then you had the kind of rules of terrorism put on top of these cartels. And it caused all of these issues when you use laws of war against people who are fundamentally not combatants. This was absolutely something that Congress needed to weigh and Congress needed to make the law on. The government breaks down when you have the executive making up new law. This was a role of Congress, and Congress, for the reasons that Representative Bacon described, failed to act. And I think that
informed of it, in fact, right? Most people. So that was even more. I'm going to guess, sir, that this might be one of the reasons you're retiring. But I'm going to open this up to the room now, and you have fantastic experts here from the New York Times, Lupe Venezuelan, who's worked very closely on these human rights issues, member of Congress who's been very vocal on this issue, and one of our own experts here from our university. So take advantage of these experts, and I'm just going to kind of randomly go ahead. So raise your hand. All I ask is that you make sure your questions end with a question mark and that they're brief so we can get as many, because we've got a crowded room and some wonderful experts, and I want to make sure everyone gets a chance. So who's first?
Study major, and I just had a quick thing that I wanted to follow. Oh, yes, ma'am, okay. I just want to have follow up on a quick thing that was mentioned earlier by the professor on sort of the implications this might have for other places in the world, and this was a broader discussion. But we had Trump say on Truth Social, Iranian patriots keep protesting, take over your institutions, help is on the way. MAGA, but it was misspelled.
No, that was make Iran great again.
Oh, make Iran great again.
MAGA.
Properly spelled.
There we go, to my point. So I just want to ask, if he's saying things like this, of course, as Genesis mentioned, Trump is unpredictable. What is the potential for, military action by the United States in Iran?
Okay, I'll jump in. I think it's potential. I would prefer if the president used more clandestine information, cyber, things like that. And so if he's doing stuff behind the scenes, I applaud it. Here's my background. When I was in Iraq, the biggest threat to where I was at was Iranian-funded militias. We lost 609 Americans in Iraq from these Shia militias that were taking orders from Soleimani, which is the IRGC. We also lost several hundred Marines in Lebanon decades earlier. I had a friend killed at Khobar Towers. So I sure hope for a better regime, a better government in Iran that's at peace with its neighbors and out of war with us. But you referenced something about we're setting a bad precedent. I worry about that. One of the reasons I want to have a war powers resolution for Venezuela and to have this debate in Congress is I worry that we're setting a standard that Russia and China can also use for their not so kind goals. I mean, I want to get a good democracy in Venezuela. I'd like to see better government in Iran. But that's not what Russia wants to do with Ukraine, or that's not what China wants to do with Taiwan. And I'm afraid that of an international order where might makes right is a dangerous world. And so I would prefer us being within an international law framework where we deal with this multilaterally and working with each other and having discussions at the United Nations and things like that. I yield.
Another question? Thank you, sir. Another question in the room? Over here? I think there's a couple people over here. You can go ahead and keep your hands up too, so we can make sure that we get to you quickly.
Hello. So you just mentioned setting a precedent that.
They know who you're talking
Oh,
to.
yeah. Hi, my name is Jan. I'm an exchange student at the University of Chicago now, studying political science and also Middle Eastern studies. So you just mentioned setting a precedent, and you mentioned international law. There was just reporting out about one of the planes carrying out the attack disguised as a civilian plane. When you mentioned precedent and international law, can we expect consequences that Congress is going to set? And if not, what implications does that have, both to our allies and to our adversaries?
And Julian was one of the bylines in that story, by the way, so.
Yeah, so if you didn't read the story, we reported that one of the planes used in the first strike was not painted in traditional military colors, but looked like a civilian plane. And we know in that operation, there were survivors who climbed up on the wreckage and waved to a plane overhead. And you know, they did not know at this point in the first strike that the U.S. was at war with the drug cartels. And it is in the context of a military conflict, both international law and actual U.S. law of the military's law of armed conflict would outlaw using firing at a combatant in disguise, right? This is something that is very clear in military handbooks, in the law of armed conflict. The question is, right, what are the consequences of this? And this goes back to what Representative Bacon was saying is, will Congress hold the president to account? There are people in Congress who are concerned about this. There are other people in Congress who say, no, this is not a big deal because it had a transponder that was squawking, but it would, the only practical way for this to be examined is if Congress was to hold hearings and take a look. So it is ultimately up to Congress to make that decision. I don't think international law is not really the venue here. It would be United States law and the United States Congress.
If I may just piggyback real briefly, I do think Congress should vote on this, should debate this, should have oversight hearings. That said, a lot of us that demand that would have some appetite for support. I mean, I'm one of 9 kids in my family. I've lost three of my younger brothers to drugs. I'm from the Chicago area. 2 of them died in Chicago, by the way. And so there's obviously 100,000 people a year we were losing. There is an appetite to try to respond to this, but I believe continued operations is required to have a war powers authorization by Congress. One other thing I'd like to add, I've served nearly 30 years in the Air Force. Most often, these boats would never even see an airplane. We're flying a RPA that you can't see too easily. It would be hard to pick out of the sky. And a lot of it's total surprise when a munition hits. That would be the most common thing that these boats would have happen. No warning at all.
Is there a question back there? Any other questions? Please identify yourself so they know who they're hearing.
Yes. Hello, my name is Clara. I'm a graduate student at Harris, and I'm also Venezuelan. I guess my question is twofolded. The first one is, this is obviously happening in an electoral year. Do we think the fact that this has not really had a rally around the flag type of thing, like polling is showing Americans either disapprove of the operations, approve of the way Trump is handling the situation, or don't really, especially don't want like a long intervention of the US in Venezuela? Do we think this happening in an electoral year will have any impact in the midterm election? And is that something that the administration is taking into account or could have an impact in the way the administration acts? And the second question, sort of like twofolded, is the Chavista regime that's still in place, acknowledging the fact that after the midterm elections, Congress could be divided, is that something that they're counting on? That is that something that they could be counting on, the fact that after the midterm elections, things could be complicated for the Trump administration?
Genesis? Do you want to answer the second
Oh,
part?
okay, I'm sorry. I couldn't hear you too well. I heard the question though. I think where the president and his team should be dedicated to putting in the legitimate leadership in Venezuela. And as from what I could tell, they won 70% to 30%, though it was a stolen election. So who knows the exact percentage, but Gonzalez looked like he won an overwhelming landslide and voters wanted Maduro out. So I'm concerned that our president and our team do not seem to be focusing or prioritizing this. And if we're going to take this kind of action, we should be doing it for, I would say, a higher values and higher goals. And I guess it gets back to some of my concern of this administration. I'm old Ronald Reagan type guy. But this president is not of that mode. He's more transactional, whereas I'm more of a blend of realism and idealism. I see us being a leader of the free world, trying to do good things and working with our allies to do good things for freedom. I don't think this president comes from that angle. And that's why there's no immediate plan to put a legitimate person in place. And the only focus I hear is oil, which is not where I think most Americans are at.
Genesis, did you want to answer the second part about how people might view, is that for her, about different control in Washington?
Okay, is this to me?
Yeah, that's to Genesis. Do you think that people in Venezuela are paying any attention to U.S. elections, I guess?
Oh, I don't think so right now, but I do believe the president is focused on this. And I don't know if he thinks this Venezuela thing will have an impact one way or the other way. I think it's too early to say. Their view of it, it's all about the economy and inflation and affordability. And that's where the president and his team's at. And I think our leadership is that's going to be the biggest variable in this coming election. Do people feel better off? That's the mindset. Whether it's true or not, I don't know.
Go ahead, sir.
Hi, I'm Alejandro, a booth student. I'm from Colombia. Quick question on hypotheticals, because of course this was a very surgical attack or operation, and Maduro was left alive. He was taken alive. Perhaps this is for the representative, but how does the U.S. in situations like this assess the risk of an operation of this scale, the taking of a president from its own palace, and what would have happened if something other than him being alive would have?
I've had the top secret briefings twice or three times now, minute by minute of the whole operation. This operation was planned for months, practiced every day with different contingencies. And you're talking about our special forces. And I used to work with them when I was in the Air Force. They call it sandbox. They practice this every day, multiple times, and they built models and you name it. I mean, it was an exquisitely planned, a very complicated operation, but there was risk, and I think there's a strategic risk in that this could backfire. But the tactical risk was significant. But we had 7 wounded soldiers. But in the end, they performed flawlessly. But there's still risk when we have Maduro and we have the vice president still in power. So somebody asked me, is this a successful operation or not? And I said, it's too early to say. There's still decisions to be made that were going to impact our final conclusion here.
I'd quickly add that it's important to remember that the Venezuelan military was weaker than it appeared, right? We did a story about how their Russian air defense equipment, they couldn't maintain it, they couldn't operate it. They were all in a hangar because they couldn't get the radar to work. And so they had the intelligence that a big swath of Venezuelan military was also on leave during the holidays. So it was obviously the insertion of this was high risk. Obviously, they're very highly trained, but this was also in some ways a more permissive environment. You could not do this to a China. You could not do this to a Russia. And, you might not even be able to do it to another country in South America that is in a better situation than Venezuela.
If I may add one thing, though, don't forget there's cyber and electronic warfare. I'm a non-kinetics guy in the military, so there could have been some of that stuff with the radar, if I may just throw that out there. Other stuff going on that created confusion.
And I think we have time for one or two more.
I want to make a comment before the next question, but since we have here the representative, so don't you think this was also an easy operation because of the collaboration of different figures from the regime, like perhaps Delcy herself, because it was such a simple operation, and then the collaboration of Delcy as vice president was like immediate, so somehow it seems like she might have betrayed Maduro.
That's a theory that's out there. I don't have any confirmation of that. I would tell you, the operation was a little more complex, 200 aircraft, a lot of different moving parts, and everything had to be synchronized down to the second. And they were using non-kinetic type stuff. As I already mentioned, I'm an electronic warfare guy and a cyber guy by trade. And so this was a very complex operation. That said, the administration will tell you that the vice president is very helpful right now because they control all of her oil. And if she wants any money, that she's got to work with the administration on the sale of that oil. So they feel like they have economic coercive power over her right now.
Julian, what does your reporting in the intelligence community say about her cooperation?
What my reporting says is that there was an assessment that she would be cooperative. They were obviously negotiating with her about the potential Maduro leaving, but I do not have any reporting about an agreement that she made ahead of time.
What Genesis is not implying, is stating that perhaps she was actually dimed him out and that she was a part of the operation from the beginning.
My reporting does not support that right now, but I'm always have an open mind.
Okay, that seems like a great place to end on an open mind. Julian, you might be staying around. He's going to the airport. You might be here a few more minutes if students want to visit with him. Representative Genesis, Professor, thank you so much for taking your time today. This was a great event. We always appreciate you and your support of the Institute of Politics, and we hope we'll see you again. Thanks, everybody, for coming out.
I appreciate you seeing me late. I apologize for being late, but thank you.
Yeah. Pleasure to join.